Hi, my name is Ed Taylor. I'm a professor in the College of Education, and I serve as Dean and Vice Provost of Undergraduate Academic Affairs at the University of Washington on the Seattle campus. I want to introduce a highlight reel of a course that is across our three campuses, so it's supported by our chancellors at Bothell and Tacoma and our president and provost at the University of Washington. This is a course on dialogue, on disagreement and democracy, and the fundamental premise of this course is that dialogue across difference and interconnectedness still matters. The ability to sit, whether it's in coffee shops or whether it's in classrooms or in our respective communities or in global discourse, that connecting with one another matters. So here's some clips of the course where I've been able to bring together thought leaders, whether they be scholars, whether they be local politicians, whether they be global leaders, who are working with the same premise, that the ability to engage with one another, to dialogue and maybe even disagree better, that it still matters, and it matters to the forming of a civil and decent society, and it matters in the forming of democracy. Here's some clips that I hope you find meaning and wisdom in. I'm grateful for my colleagues who have participated in this course. I want to read something that you've written, Will, that you sent to me within the last few weeks. You said, as we approach the start of a new school year, with colleges and universities welcoming both new and returning students, there's an undercurrent of uncertainty. Will it be more protests, more divisions, more seemingly intractable issues, which we all, whether on campuses or not, are having difficulty discussing with civility and compassion? You raise these questions. Say more about the uncertainty that you invoke here and how uncertainty works. And what is your greatest hope for a university where we've got thousands on this campus, close to 40,000 students in a generation that is being educated and prepared to lead after we're gone?
Yeah.
What's the uncertainty that you're invoking here?
So I wonder whether we can bridge some of these chasms. You know, I mean, you have to be able to talk to each other. You have to be able to trust. You have to feel like the ground you're standing on is stable. You know, it's interesting. I used to lead students on these trips around the world. And one of the things that I would point out, and it's noticeable even right here, right, is that in this room, right, temperature's controlled, the lighting's controlled, there are windows keeping the sound out, insulation in. We trust that the electricity's gonna work. We trust that nobody is gonna come riotously breaking in and threatening our safety. Mm-hmm. Now, in that environment, you can have a conversation because you can let your guard down because some of those fundamental Maslow's hierarchy of needs, some of those base survival things are taken care of, so you can start talking. But if you don't have that safety, and by the way, that's actually, I think it was illustrated yesterday, when you don't have that safety, when you don't have that sense that I feel comfortable and safe here, then what you're doing is you're basically, there's a sense of hypervigilance, and you have to question, is what I'm going to say be used against me? Is it gonna be twisted into something else? Are people gonna give me the generosity if I make a mistake, or are they gonna tweet that to gazillions of people, and am I going to have to be worried for my family's safety at home? That's the uncertainty. And we have a choice. We all have a choice. We can sit on the sidelines and we can let that all happen. We can decide, no, actually, I'm going to police my own community, my own friends and family. I'm going to say this isn't okay. But sitting, you know, Elie Wiesel said, you know, there are people who are, you can be a victim, you can be a victimizer, or you can be a bystander. And I think, you know, the bystanders fall under the category of victimizers, because whenever any minority population is under assault, you know, you can sit on the sidelines, but you've got blood on your hands for it.
How does disagreement and this concept of, dare I say, love and connectivity work in a university setting where we're trained to disagree and argue? How does it work in the work context, especially with our faculty and our community? How do you get to a point of disagreement and connectivity and still care for one another? What does it look like in this setting?
Well, the thing is that I think what's important to keep in mind is that actually is key to our work. I mean, what you do, for example, as a scientist, you try to disprove what previous scientists did.
It's a skill set, right?
Right, it is a skill set. I think what's important is that you remember that it's an academic skill set, and that you're able, for me, one of the most intense understandings in this way was, my wife's family has a cabin in a very rural area of the Hood Canal. And I remember when we first went there were all these trucks with gun racks and so forth and so on. And, my immediate reaction was, again, partly because of my brother, et cetera, was fear. Here were people that carried guns and, this, that, and the other. But as I got to know that community, it was just, hunting was part of their culture. I changed my ideas. I still believe no one should own an AK-47. I do believe in gun control, but I do understand the importance of rifles and hunting and so forth in a way that I didn't. I may not want to participate, but I understand that. I also understand that often these folks look at us on the in the Seattle area as folks that come into their community, in Birkenstocks and Bermuda shorts and care more about owls than we do about their children, and that isn't a productive way. And I do think there's ways that we can come together. Laminated wood is a perfect way in which we can respect their need to have jobs, yet at the same time understand sustainability. And I think that key to coming up with these new solutions and these better discoveries is working across differences.
Right, and holding those tensions. Those tensions are necessary. What's your experience in working with people that are...
For me, I think the biggest danger is simplifying stories, right? We look at the challenges that we have in the world today, and they're very complex. And I think it's really important for us to elevate different ideas, not only to fully understand these complexities, but to find the path forward that is going to be beneficial to the largest number of people, right? If you're only thinking about things from your own perspective and someone is disagreeing with you, then that suggests that there are aspects of this that you haven't considered, and any solution really has to take those different opinions into account. It's a difference between a minority opinion holding a decision hostage and one that enriches that decision.
So being online is kind of the reality of life for young people now. So how do they discern truth from misinformation? What are some practical habits for figuring out what constitutes a truth when there's so much manipulation in the environment? So, and I'll take, for example, as we head into an election, and information is coming in a lot of different ways. What advice do you give to students around how to separate out what's misinformation, disinformation, and what constitutes truth?
I mean, this is a really challenging question. I wish I had, you follow these three things and you're going to be able to find, things you can trust versus things you shouldn't trust. And there's also a risk in having too much skepticism as well. We don't want people to trust nothing. We want to be able to figure out ways to put our trust in the folks that we should be putting our trust in. And we know that, the traditional ways of how information was sort of gate-kept had problems. We all got our information through the media, and they had a certain agenda. And we had this hope that the online environment would allow the information to be democratized and everyone would have a voice. But what's happened instead is that a few people have figured out how to gain that system to grab influence. And so instead of getting our information from media, we get it from influencers, especially on online environments, whether that's TikTok or Twitter or Facebook, wherever you're going. A lot of times that information is mediated by influencers. And it's challenging to figure out whether or not you should trust information that's coming through an influencer. So for me, in general, what I recommend folks do when they approach online information is one, just be aware of how we are emotionally activated. We're most vulnerable to spreading misinformation, and misinformation is most likely to spread in online environments when it activates our outrage. our anger, sometimes humor, but often it's about outrage. And so that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be feeling very upset about things that we see, but when I get emotionally activated and I feel that sort of outrage, that's my first signal that I might be manipulated and I need to double check. So we definitely recommend that people slow down, that they kind of tune into their emotional reaction to information before spreading it.
Help me understand the distinction between speech that I find bothersome and offensive and I just don't want to hear, and speech that is actual hate speech.
Right. Okay. So hate speech is a thing, and it's actually very difficult to define because the First Amendment has such a high protection of political speech. Mm-hmm. So let's go back to your first question slightly, which is to sort of, and I guess it ties in with your second question because it's really what are the limits of this protest, right? And how does that work with free speech? One of the limits of the protest is when things become dangerous to people. So when the protest turns into a riot, the protest is going to be ended as a matter of sort of law. Mm-hmm. One of the things that happens with free speech, like you're saying, is the question about hate speech. So the first thing you have to understand about the law is that the law does not have a concept of a safe space. Mm-hmm. That does not exist in First Amendment jurisprudence, all right, what the courts have to say about the First Amendment. To be alive and to be in a democracy mm-hmm. is to not have a safe place for your opinions or a safe place from other people's opinions. Mm-hmm. There is within educational culture, there has been over the past 20 or 30 years, mm-hmm. a development of a need for safe places, especially for people who've suffered a certain kind of trauma. Right. We want to provide a space for them to really flourish and heal rather than be subjected to what's happening. But when we're talking about arguments and political discourse, mm-hmm. there isn't safe space, mm-hmm. not under the law, until you hit the hate speech part. And the hate speech part is where you are really singling or targeting a person or a group of people mm-hmm. for a characteristic that they have, and you are inciting some form of violence against them.
So the National Governors Association says the following: Americans need to disagree better. And by that, we don't mean that we need to be nicer to each other, although that's helpful. We need to learn to disagree in a way that allows us to find solutions and solve problems instead of endlessly bickering. And JT, I saw a quote from you a few years ago. You said, "We've had a contentious and ideological driven election, but most people of Washington are in the center." So we've got this moment where people at least perceive that we're a polarized nation and a polarized state. What problem is the National Governors Association trying to address here? And how did we get here? JT, Derek, either one of you.
Well, I'll defer to Derek this time and then follow.
Well, let me say, I guess, a couple things on that. One, we have seen more polarization. To me, there were two polls last year that I found really troubling. One was an NBC News poll that found that 70% of Americans agree with the statement, "America is so divided that we are now incapable of solving big problems, and it's getting worse." 70% of respondents said they agreed with that. There was a perhaps appropriately titled Battleground poll that asked Americans on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being no conflict and 100 being civil war, where do you place the United States? And the median score was a 70, which I think is really alarming because it suggests Americans think we're more than 2/3 of the way to civil war. Now, you may hear that and say, well, that's just life in 2024, and we have to get accustomed to the fact that we all hate each other and can't solve big problems anymore. But I think it's important to reject that. It's important for a few reasons. One, because we have the capacity to shape the kind of government that we have. President Kennedy said in a democracy, we all hold office as citizens, and the way in which we engage with our democracy to some degree dictates the kind of government that we get. And so I think there is an effort both by the National Governors Association, by policy schools around the country, including the University of Washington, to try to rebuild some of those muscles around being able to disagree without being uncivil, about the importance of listening, about the capacity to enter into a conversation with the knowledge that you may be wrong and others in the conversation may be right, about the value of empathy. These are skills that are really fundamental to bridging the divides that we see in our country. And listen, there are a bunch of forces that are trying to make it worse, not better, right? Every time you go on cable news, you see largely messages that are meant to amplify our differences. They will never cover Derek Kilmer and JT Wilcox agreeing on something. When you go on your social media site, the algorithms are amplifying our differences. And in fact, it used to be that you could, regularly engage with people who had different perspectives. And now on your online, you can choose to only engage with people who affirm your worldview. And that makes it more difficult to understand and appreciate some of our differences and be able to engage in a way where we can disagree better. So I think it's important to try to figure out where we can actually dialogue with folks who think differently than we do. In the Congress, I actually co-chair a group called the Bipartisan Working Group, which is a group of 12 Democrats and 12 Republicans who meet each week for breakfast and try to figure out where we might be able to work on some things together. And even when we can't, we actually try to discuss some of our differences just so we have a better understanding where people are coming from.
AT?
Well, I get asked to give advice to freshman legislators quite often, and sometimes it's people of both parties. And one of the first things that I say is just turn off the TV, quit watching national news. And it's not because I want people to be uninformed or ignorant. It's because there's almost nothing being broadcast now that is even trying to present the facts in a neutral way, whether they're good for their side or not. And there's a more important reason. I don't want people to come into government and learn how to behave from the people that they see on TV. And that's a powerful model. I think you can be very successful as a politician by being yourself, but that has to be very, very intentional. And you have to really avoid getting into habits that make you look like every other angry legislator, that you see on TV. And that's very much what Derek was saying as well. And Derek's never allowed himself to be in that position. I think the other thing that is creating these forces that tear us apart is the idea on the part of activists on both the left and the right that their definition of a good leader is someone who fights. And I'm not against fighting for your point of view, but they want the fight for the sake of the fight. It's turning politics into sports. And, when that is your value, when your value is, I just want to see you fight, and I don't care what methods you use, then you're tearing down the institutions that have made our life in the United States possible.
So that's interesting. You both have such interesting personal perspectives, both being in Washington, D.C., being in the Navy, being in service. I want to ask you a question about the discourse we're having about democracy, and about the stability or vulnerability of this democracy that we believe in. Are you hopeful right now? What's the state of our democracy right now? Are we at risk? Are you concerned? Or is this old news? Both of you take this question because you both have perspective on this.
Do we have enough time? I'm going to defer to my colleague here first.
I think we are at a very vulnerable time in American democracy. And I say that, and also would add that there always have been great vulnerabilities and fragility and an incompleteness of the democracy. That the United States has been a work in progress since the beginning, and that democracy has been incomplete, woefully incomplete, for most of our history. That is not to to saying that does not sort of hand wave away, oh, don't worry, this is the way things are. Not at all. What has happened over the last 60 years has been a steady accumulation, expansion of rights as the result of sustained struggle and activism and actions from the top down, leadership and institutional strength and stability, and citizens having faith in the institutions and having faith in a broader society, something bigger than them, something to work towards. And so when these institutions and norms and laws and rules are being disregarded, and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter who's president, or it doesn't matter if we really follow the rules on how all the elections certified, or we listen to, or if we throw doubt onto the integrity of the election process itself and make people feel like, well, either my vote doesn't count, or oh, there's no point, or hey, even if I do vote, it's not going to be heard, or it's going to be suppressed in some way. That is a real danger to democracy.
You use an approach that is realistic and clear-eyed. Not everyone needs to be in conversation directly with one another, confronting one another, because there can be harms in doing so. And sometimes your approach involves speaking to an interlocutor. Talk about how that works.
It's a very personal choice what divides you want to cross. There'll be some divides you don't. People often seem to want me to set universal guidelines and restrictions on that. If you hold this identity, you should never talk to somebody with that identity because blah, 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 blah. There are so many counterexamples to that I think any policy of universal restrictions that everybody just in lockstep follows is going to destroy us. You never know what's possible. And I think even in the places where you anticipate there will be harm, there may not be. And you have to be open to those moments of that slightly open door you didn't expect. Could you walk through? That's your choice in that moment. Now, on the interlocutor piece, I think of the concept of allies, which people certainly talk a lot about. I wrestle with this. If it gets into that place of group dynamics where groups are assigned roles, and individuals are kept out of certain places where harms are projected. I actually think that the best person to have a conversation with when you have become aware of a divide that you feel you can't cross and that is scary to you and that might already be seeming to kind of damage your psyche, even if you're not approaching it, is with yourself. It's conversations with yourself. One strategy that I give is, again, you don't have to go and march up to somebody who scares you. Don't do that. Don't do that. It's not going to be a good conversation if you're in that state of mind. So instead, next time that you see a headline in the news that shows a point of view that you really disagree with, but that is held by a lot of people, right? It's held by a lot of people. It's not so deviant as like flat earth. Like, it's held by a lot of people. Then click on that article and see if you can read that article, asking yourself two questions. What deep down honest concerns inform this person's perspective? And what is the strongest argument on this side? And those are two very difficult questions for you to ask yourself. If you are in such a sharp place of disagreement that you can't even imagine approaching someone who holds this view. So really what you're doing is you're practicing curiosity in your own mind. And it can be a real challenge, but I would say those are the first steps. Those are the first steps.
When I was writing about the Truth Commission and my work on the Truth Commission, at the early stages of my research, one scripture that I liked repeating for myself, but sometimes also for audiences, I think it's from the Old Testament. I can't remember now which book it is from, but it says something along the lines of, "Behold, I do a new thing." And so I really like that, because that idea of "behold, I do a new thing" speaks to the idea of the importance of a truth commission in the context of a country that was trying to heal itself. And it was something new. It was new in the sense that the way that the Truth Commission in South Africa was set up was different from how it was designed in other countries. You know, in other countries, it was people being invited behind closed doors to speak about the traumas that they experienced. Here, it was public. Not only was it public for people to talk about their pain they suffered, but those who were applying for amnesty, to be considered for amnesty, perpetrators of these crimes, we demanded that they also speak publicly about what they did, so that they're not offered amnesty behind closed doors, because what they did was very much public. And so for the first time in a country that was ruled by secrets, secret operations, apartheid operations, murderous squads and hit squads, the training of informants who were trained to inform on activists, on anti-apartheid. Everything was secret about apartheid. Here, the commission demanded that everything be brought into the open so that we can face what happened in the country openly and pronounce it in public. And so that people also who had suffered trauma could speak in public about what they endured in the past. That was openness, full disclosure was the term that the commission used. Full disclosure, in order for us, for individuals who had been hurt and people who were then collectively suffering from these past traumas, could also embark on that journey of collective healing. The value of the commission was that it was facing the tragedy of the past squarely in the eye and demanding of the people who caused the harms to testify and also face, South Africans and the world about what they did. And the value of this, the importance of this acknowledgement of what happened in the past was really for victims and survivors to see that there was a body that was acknowledging in the presence of everybody else that what was done to them was wrong. And that was the beginning of dealing with the trauma, the beginning of opening the door to the possibility of healing of the trauma. Because when people are traumatized, often in these contexts, often there is such a secrecy about who did it, who is responsible, who commanded, who gave the orders. There's such a secrecy that they don't know how to mourn. You don't know how to mourn when you don't have the truth. And so the importance of healing from trauma begins with the journey of mourning. And so that process of acknowledgement and truth-seeking and truth-telling are components of the beginnings of the healing of trauma.
This is so interesting to me because part of the premise of this course is on dialogue, disagreement, and democracy. And one of the things I'm questioning is whether now socially, in terms of social phenomenon, political phenomenon, whether people actually change their mind. As scientists, data can drive you to say, I was wrong about that. I'm going to take a different perspective on this. Do you think that can apply to social circumstances as well, or political circumstances where people can change their mind? Does science help us in our thinking around social phenomena as well?
I think that a scientist approaching a question where data is presented to the contrary has to be willing to dissolve their bit of ego and say, I was wrong, as you just discussed a moment ago. When that ego is tied up in fear of losing your job because you made a mistake in your data analysis, or socially losing your job because somebody who has different skills is able to move in, or there's just too many people to take your job, or whatever. When that runs up against a fear that's part of society's, fear of the world, then I think it's really hard to change your mind. So as I mentioned earlier, I think when you talk to someone who has a very set, hard opinion, my way of thinking about it is, what is this person afraid of? What is it? What are they afraid of that is going to disappear out of their lives if such X, if event X happens? What will change in their lives that they are afraid of? So maybe I'm not directly answering your question, but I think if we could remove the element of fear and personal fear from a social discussion, we might be able to actually get further. And scientists should be able to do that. That's a big should.
That's a big thing to enter into this, to removing the element of fear that drives so much behavior, I think is what you're saying. Do you agree with that? That fear drives
social behavior.
Social behavior.
I think for some people, they're more comfortable with not knowing. And for some people, not knowing is a huge fear of theirs. To a degree, I would say yes. I'll say that in the 2016 election, since we're talking in the context of democracy, I work in the space of healthcare technology, and we think about what is the influx of AI, what does AI look like? But if we go backwards, AI is not something new for us within the world. If you look at 2016, the reason that a lot of echo chambers happened at that time, particularly around social media networks, was that if you clicked a link, our very well-trained AI systems would realize that maybe you like this kind of content, and it would feed you more of that, and it would create this loop that would further that. And inherently, if your worldview only has that type of truth, whether with a capital T that you've believed or with a lowercase t, now anything outside of that engenders fear because it doesn't fit into that world construct. Mm-hmm. In the aftermath of that election, there was at least somewhat of an effort. Now, if I look at my news feeds, whether it's within a social media network or within Google News, for example, you will inevitably see opposing viewpoints that make you at least take a second and pause and think to yourself, is there another way of viewing the same exact issue where the person feels completely different than I feel? I may not ingest that information, but it's now presented to me in that way. I will tell you, sometimes I feel afraid. I don't want to always be living in a world where I don't know the truth, or I don't know what truth means to me. And so that does make me feel worried. But when I take a step back and I detach myself from the fact that the truth is relative to a degree, that it's always morphing, it's always changing, that there are things that seemingly continue to be true, it lets me feel less afraid. So I think for others, they are more comfortable with that, seeing an opposing view, and for others, they really just aren't comfortable because their worldview's only been in that smaller sort of crafted, curated world.
Yeah.